Judge mocks an elderly woman, in court shocked to know she's a legendary attorney. The autumn morning in New York was cold, but inside the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, the atmosphere burned with arrogance. The kind only those certain of victory carried. Laughter echoed off the dark wooden walls, slicing through the heavy air like sharp blades. Seated high on his black leather judge's chair, Judge Raymond Carter, a man in his 60s with neatly combed silver hair, leaned back lazily, a mocking smile curling on his lips. He tapped his gavel lightly, his voice dripping with contempt. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place? This is a court of law, not a knitting club. Did you wander in looking for your grandkids?" The courtroom burst into laughter. It rang out, loud and cruel, bouncing off the wooden benches and polished floor. Every chuckle, every smirk was like a slap in the face of the silver-haired woman standing quietly at the defense table. Margaret Hamilton, dressed in a simple beige suit, her veined and frail hands resting steadily on the worn wooden table, stood tall and unmoved. Her eyes, sharp, cold, and heavy with the weight of a life well lived, stared straight at Carter. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. Her stillness silenced the room, not out of fear, but out of the terrifying calm of a woman who'd seen it all. Carter's grin widened, his voice heavy with mockery. "You really think you can represent yourself? An old lady like you? Do you even know how to argue in a courtroom?" The room stilled, waiting. Then, slowly, deliberately, Margaret adjusted the lapels of her blazer. Her voice, low but steady, cut through the heavy silence. "Your Honor, I advise you choose your words carefully." The air shifted. A hushed gasp rippled through the courtroom. The clerk's pen froze mid-air. Even the bailiff stood straighter, eyes darting between the judge and the woman. Judge Carter forced a chuckle, but it lacked conviction. "And why's that?" Margaret leaned in, her voice like steel. "Because I've won more cases than you've ever presided over, Judge Carter. And you just made a very big mistake." The words hit like thunder. Murmurs erupted. The prosecutor, Thomas Bennett, well-groomed and arrogant in his expensive blue suit, sat frozen, his eyes wide, his smirk wiped clean. Carter's face darkened, his fingers tightening around the bench. Who are you?" Just 2 days earlier, in a small, dusty cafe on Fifth Avenue, Margaret Hamilton sat quietly sipping her tea. Golden sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, reflecting off her silver hair. Nearby, 2 young lawyers laughed cockily, unaware of the storm they were about to face. "I'm telling you, this case is a guaranteed win," one of them boasted. "That old lady doesn't stand a chance. Judge Carter's going to tear her apart," the other smirked. "He'll crush her, just like he did that law student last month." Margaret smiled faintly, setting her teacup down with a soft clink. Rising gracefully, she adjusted her blazer, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she walked out. Every step echoed with quiet confidence. Not the step of a frail old woman, but of a warrior preparing for battle. That night, her apartment glowed softly as the city lights twinkled outside. Surrounded by stacks of legal documents, Margaret's frail hands moved swiftly, highlighting, circling, noting. Her eyes glinted with purpose. "They think I'm done. They forget I wrote the rules they play by," she muttered. Later, her young assistant Daniel called, his voice shaky. "Miss Hamilton, Carter is ruthless. They all think you're just an old lady." Margaret chuckled, low and confident. "Good. That's exactly what I want." The next morning, clad in her simple beige suit, Margaret walked into the courtroom. Each step on the marble floor echoed loudly. Click, clack, click, demanding attention. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, some lips curled in amusement. The bailiff stepped forward, confused. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" Margaret simply handed him her neatly folded legal notice, smiling softly. "You'll know soon enough." And then Judge Carter opened his mouth, launching into his rehearsed mockery, loud and dismissive. But when Margaret calmly declared who she truly was, the air in the courtroom froze solid. The color drained from Carter's face. He gripped the bench as realization crashed over him. The woman standing before him wasn't just some elderly retiree. She was the former chief zoning attorney of New York City, the very person who had written the laws he was now attempting to use against her. Carter swallowed hard, his pride wounded. The whispers grew louder. Margaret stood tall, eyes burning with unyielding defiance. She had been underestimated, again. But this time, she would remind them all, she was Margaret Hamilton. And she had returned not just to win, but to teach them what real power looked like. The entire courtroom froze in a suffocating silence. Pale morning light streamed through the high, dusty windows, casting long beams across the cold gray tiles, deepening the heavy atmosphere. Up on the bench, Judge Raymond Carter squinted, his lips pressed into a thin line as his pale knuckles gripped the wooden gavel. The man who had ruled this courtroom for years, feared untouchable, felt for the first time a cold shiver of something unfamiliar. Fear. Standing tall in the center of the room was Margaret Hamilton, the silver-haired woman everyone had laughed at just moments before. Her sharp eyes swept over the frozen crowd, cold and unyielding. The beige suit she wore hugged her frail but upright figure, her posture firm, defiant. In front of her, Thomas Bennett, the young, ambitious prosecutor, stood trembling. The thick legal file in his hands shook uncontrollably, his face drained of color as he stared at Margaret like he was seeing a ghost. Judge Carter forced out a laugh, though it rang hollow. "Mrs. Lawson, no. Hamilton, is it? You dare interrupt the prosecution in my courtroom?" Margaret slowly raised her head, her voice low but carried through the heavy air like a sharp blade. "I did not interrupt, Your Honor. I stopped a blatant lie." The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp. Whispered shock rippled through the crowd like a tidal wave. Some hands flew to mouths, others stared wide-eyed. Bennett's face burned red, his lips moved but no sound came out. Carter slammed his gavel hard, the crack of wood against wood slicing through the air like a gunshot. "Silence! I said silence!" Margaret, calm as ever, reached into her worn leather briefcase and pulled out a yellow document, carefully preserved. Holding it high, her gaze never wavered. "I have proof, Your Honor. Proof that every accusation brought against me is false." "Impossible!" Bennett cried, stumbling forward as if to snatch the paper from her hand. But Margaret took a step back, a cold smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "You want to see it? Come and get it." Carter's eyes darted between the two before he finally growled, "Bring it here, now." With slow, deliberate steps, Margaret approached the bench. Each footstep echoed loudly, a steady, rhythmic sound like a drumbeat of impending doom. Reaching the judge, she laid the paper down gently, then took a single step back, her eyes locked onto Carter's face. Carter slipped on his glasses, his hands visibly trembling as he read. His face paled, breath shallow, eyes widening with every passing second. Behind him, Bennett stood stiff as stone, the color draining from his face. The courtroom was so silent that even the faint ticking of the old wall clock sounded deafening. Margaret stood firm, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. Finally, Carter looked up, his voice cracking. This is a zoning exemption, signed 30 years ago?" Margaret nodded slowly, her voice steady, sharp as a blade. "Signed by me, Your Honor. Back when I was this city's chief zoning attorney." Another wave of gasps thundered through the room. Several people stood, mouths agape. Bennett stumbled backward, shaking his head in disbelief. No, that's not possible." Carter's hands trembled as he pointed to Bennett. "Well? Do you have anything to say, counselor?" Bennett's mouth opened, then closed. He looked defeated, lost. No further argument, Your Honor." Margaret turned her gaze slowly, scanning every face in the courtroom. Daniel, her young assistant, stood frozen at the back, his eyes wide with pride and awe. The judge cleared his throat, his voice no more than a whisper now. "Then, the court finds in favor of Margaret Hamilton." The words fell like a death sentence. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few stifled sobs echoed around the chamber, but Margaret simply nodded once, her lips curving into the faintest smile of victory. Without waiting, she gathered her things and turned, walking away from the defendant's stand. Each step was measured, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, a sound that seemed to ring like a triumphant anthem. Behind her, the courtroom remained frozen. For the first time, the mighty Judge Carter had been silenced, not by force, but by truth. The sunlight through the windows seemed to follow Margaret, bathing her in a soft golden glow as she pushed open the heavy courtroom doors. And just like that, the woman they all underestimated walked out victorious. The late afternoon sun began to sink behind the towering buildings of New York City, casting long golden shadows across the marble steps of the courthouse. Margaret Hamilton walked calmly down those steps, her breathing steady, heart no longer weighed down by the courtroom's suffocating air. The sound of her heels echoed with quiet triumph, each step a reminder that she had just won, and proved them all wrong. Beside her, Daniel, young, eager, still wide-eyed, struggled to keep up. "Miss Hamilton?" he called breathlessly, clutching his notepad. "That was incredible. I mean, I knew you were good, but the way you shut them down." Margaret offered only a faint smile. "Expected, Daniel. Never forget. It's not about how loud they shout, it's about what you know." Daniel opened his mouth to reply, but a sudden sound stopped him. The low hum of an approaching black car pulling up to the curb. Its dark-tinted windows gleamed under the fading sunlight. Slowly, the back window rolled down with a soft mechanical whir. Margaret stiffened. From the shadows inside, a familiar, chilling voice drifted out. Smooth, confident, laced with venom. "Margaret Hamilton, still causing trouble, I see." Daniel frowned, confused. "Who?" But Margaret didn't answer. Her jaw clenched, breath caught. She hadn't heard that voice in decades, a ghost from a past she'd worked so hard to bury. Slowly she turned, locking eyes with the man inside. James Calloway. Even after all these years, he hadn't changed. The same sharp features, the same arrogant smirk tugging at his lips. His dark eyes gleamed with that same predatory confidence, like he owned everything, like no one could touch him. "You remember me," Calloway chuckled, resting an elbow lazily on the car door. "Of course, how could you forget? After all, you're the reason I fell." Daniel's eyes widened. "James Calloway? The corrupt district attorney? But you were disbarred. You disappeared." Calloway's grin widened, flashing a row of perfect predatory teeth. "Disbarred, yes. Disappeared? Not quite. I was just biding my time." The city noise seemed to fade. All Margaret could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, a steady thrum of warning. Her voice was calm but laced with quiet steel. "What do you want, Calloway?" he laughed. Low, dark, full of something dangerous. "Oh, Margaret. You think I'd miss your grand little comeback? No. I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. The mighty Margaret Hamilton, still fighting, still sharp." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why now? Why show up now?" Calloway's smirk faded just slightly. His voice lowered. "Because I'm back, and things in this city, they're about to change." Margaret's fists clenched. "You don't belong here, James. You lost." Calloway shrugged lazily. "Maybe, but the city never really changes, does it? Power, corruption, greed. All I have to do is pick up where I left off." He paused, his dark gaze drilling into hers. "And maybe settle some old scores." Daniel shifted nervously. "This is insane. You can't just come back after all these years. You have no power." Calloway's laugh was cruel. "Ha! That's where you're wrong, kid. Power? It's not about titles or badges. It's about knowing where the bodies are buried, about knowing who still owes you." His smirk returned. "And trust me, plenty of people in this city still owe me." The words hit Margaret like a cold wave. She had fought so hard to take him down all those years ago, exposed every crime, every dirty deal. She'd watched as his career crumbled, as the headlines screamed his name in disgrace. But somehow, deep down, she'd always known this wasn't over. Calloway's eyes glinted with something dark. "You really thought you'd seen the last of me? You should know better, Margaret. Men like me, we don't disappear. We wait." A heavy silence settled between them, thick as smoke. Finally, Calloway reached into the car's glove compartment and pulled out a black envelope. Sleek, smooth, ominous. He held it up between two fingers. Consider this. An invitation. Margaret didn't move. Calloway's smirk deepened. Take it. Or don't, either way. We'll be seeing each other again very soon. With that, he tossed the envelope onto the sidewalk. It landed with a soft thud, dark against the pale concrete. Daniel stared at it, his face pale. Miss Hamilton. Margaret's eyes stayed locked on Calloway. You come near me again, James, and I will bury you. Calloway only laughed, loud, echoing, like the city belonged to him. Oh, Margaret, you tried that once. Didn't stick. Let's see how round 2 plays out, shall we? The car window rolled up slowly, swallowing his face in shadow. The engine roared to life, and in a blink, the black car peeled away, disappearing into the chaos of the city. For a long moment, neither Margaret nor Daniel moved. The only sound was the wind whistling down the empty street, rustling the papers in Daniel's trembling hands. Finally, Margaret exhaled. Slow, steady, forcing the air back into her lungs. Miss Hamilton? What does this mean? Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret didn't take her eyes off the street where Calloway's car vanished. Her voice, when it came, was cold as ice. It means war. Daniel swallowed hard. But he's finished, right? Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile. Men like James Calloway don't stay finished, Daniel. They wait. Until the city forgets. Until the right moment. Daniel's hands trembled. What do we do? Margaret bent down slowly, picking up the black envelope. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she stared at it for a long moment, as if weighing the weight of the past, the cost of what was coming. Then her voice came, soft but brimming with quiet fury. We finish what we started. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in blood-red streaks as New York City braced for the return of a ghost it had long since buried. James Calloway was back, and this time he wasn't alone. The night air of New York was thick, carrying the weight of secrets and unfinished wars. Margaret Hamilton sat quietly in the backseat of a dark sedan, her sharp eyes gazing out at the endless city skyline glittering with artificial lights. Beside her, Daniel fidgeted nervously with his notebook, while Vincent, calm, calculating, lit a cigarette, the faint ember glowing in the dark. We're not just chasing Calloway, Margaret murmured, her voice low and cold. We're hunting the money, and whoever gave him the power to rise again. Daniel swallowed hard. Are you sure this is the right way, Margaret? Vincent's contact, this banker. If Calloway left him alive, it's because he's still useful. Margaret's lips curled into a faint smirk. Exactly, and that's why we need him. The car rumbled down narrow alleys, past the neon glare of late-night diners and the distant wail of a siren fading into the city's restless night. Finally, Vincent exhaled a trail of smoke, his eyes narrowing at a rusted sign barely hanging above a rundown bar. He's in there, Vincent said flatly. David Langley used to be one of the best. Fixer for the elite. Then Calloway fell and Langley vanished. I'm surprised he's still breathing. Margaret adjusted her coat, every movement precise. The soft click of the door echoed as she stepped out. Then let's find out why. The three of them entered the bar. The air inside reeked of cheap whiskey, sweat, and regret. Dim yellow lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the cracked wooden floor. A jukebox in the corner played a haunting jazz melody, the notes trembling like dying whispers. At the far end of the bar, hunched over a glass of bourbon, sat David Langley. Once a powerful man in tailored suits, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. His gray hair was unkempt, his eyes sunken and hollow. Margaret approached him without hesitation, the sound of her heels echoing sharply in the silent bar. David Langley, she greeted, her voice steady but cold. Langley flinched, then looked up slowly, his bloodshot eyes widening in recognition. Margaret Hamilton, he rasped, his voice gravelly. I thought you were dead. I could say the same, Margaret replied, sliding into the seat across from him. Daniel hovered close, nervous, while Vincent leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. What do you want? Langley muttered, taking another shaky sip. I'm done, out. I don't know anything. Margaret's eyes darkened. Liar. You worked for Calloway. You moved his money, offshore, buried so deep no one could trace it. But I know you, David. You never really walked away. Langley laughed bitterly, the sound dry and hollow. And if I did, what makes you think I'd tell you where it is? Because if you don't, Vincent drawled lazily, we'll just assume you're still working for him, and I don't think you'd survive that much longer. Langley's hand trembled. The glass clinked loudly against the table. He stared at Margaret, a long pause filling the space between them like a suffocating fog. You don't understand, he whispered. It's not just Calloway. It's Hale. Senator Richard Hale. He's the one pulling the strings now. Calloway's just a pawn. The word sent a chill through Daniel's spine. Margaret's jaw clenched. Where's the money, Langley? Langley's eyes darted around the bar, paranoid. Then slowly he reached into his tattered jacket and pulled out a weathered notebook. Its leather cover cracked with age. I kept it just in case, he muttered. Calloway thought he owned me, but I made sure to keep my way out. He slid the notebook across the table. Margaret opened it carefully, scanning the messy scrawls of account numbers, offshore banks, and shadow corporations. One name stood out, circled in red. The Haven Trust. What is this? Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Langley's eyes filled with dread. The final vault. A shadow bank, not registered anywhere. Hale's personal playground. If you follow this trail, you'll find them all. Margaret's breath hitched. She could almost hear the sound of the puzzle snapping into place. Where is it? Langley chuckled bitterly. Atlantic City. Fitting, right? A city built on corruption, hiding the dirtiest secret of them all. Vincent let out a low whistle. Figures. You ready for this, Margaret? She stood slowly, her eyes sharp as blades. I've been ready since the day Calloway crawled back from the grave. Langley grabbed her wrist suddenly, his grip surprisingly strong for a broken man. If you go after them, you better finish it. They won't let you walk away. Margaret stared at him, her voice cold as ice. I'm not planning to walk away. With that she turned, the notebook clutched tightly in her hand. The three of them exited the bar, the door creaking shut behind them. Outside the air was colder, the wind biting against their skin. Daniel shivered. Are we really doing this? Margaret's gaze was locked on the distant lights of Atlantic City. We don't stop now. That notebook, that's the map to the heart of this whole rotten empire. Vincent smirked, flicking his cigarette into the gutter. Guess we're going to Atlantic City then. Margaret nodded once. Gear up. We leave at dawn. As they disappeared into the night, the city behind them seemed to hold its breath, because what they were about to uncover wouldn't just bring down Calloway. It would shake the very foundations of power itself. Night fell over Atlantic City, casting a crimson hue across the gray sky as neon lights flickered like restless spirits. The distant sound of waves crashing against the shore mixed with the cold wind that howled through empty streets. At the very end of a desolate road near the waterfront stood a towering glass building, sleek, soulless, and silent. The Haven Trust. No name, no sign, no logo. But Margaret Hamilton knew this was the beating black heart of everything corrupt. She gripped the worn leather notebook left by Langley, her sharp eyes glinting with determination. Beside her, Daniel's face was pale with fear, and Vincent sneered, grinding his cigarette into the pavement. There's no coming back from this, Margaret. Then let's finish it, she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of a final judgment. Without another word, the three of them moved toward the building. Their shadows stretched long and thin under the harsh glow of the streetlights. The glass doors slid open silently, revealing a cold, sterile lobby bathed in blinding white light. Behind the marble reception desk, a young woman looked up, her expression lifeless, eyes like frozen glass. I have an appointment, Margaret spoke, her voice steady but icy. The receptionist said nothing, simply lifted the phone, whispered a few words, then nodded. Go up, he's waiting. Daniel swallowed hard, the sound of his dry throat unnervingly loud in the still air. He's here, he whispered, and they all knew who he was. The elevator doors closed behind them with a metallic clang, echoing like the bars of a prison cell locking shut. The car shot upward, floor after floor flashing past in a blur, carrying them closer to the lion's den. When these doors open, Vincent murmured, nothing will ever be the same. Margaret's grip tightened around the notebook, her knuckles turning white. Ding! The doors slid open. They stepped out into a vast, opulent office, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering Atlantic City skyline. And there, standing like a king awaiting his throne, was James Calloway, perfectly tailored black suit, crimson tie like a streak of blood, and eyes sharp with arrogant triumph. "Margaret Hamilton," Calloway's voice echoed, smooth and venomous. "You actually came." Margaret took a single step forward, her heels clicking against the marble like the toll of a funeral bell. "I came to end this." Calloway laughed, a deep, mocking sound that filled the room. "End? Margaret, look around. This is my empire. Here, I am the law." Margaret said nothing. Instead, she slowly raised Langley's notebook, her voice cold as steel. "You forgot one thing, Calloway. I bring my own law." Calloway's smirk faltered. From the shadows another figure emerged. Senator Richard Hale, gray-hailed, sharp-suited, his eyes gleamed with cruelty and power. "So, you're the puppet master," Margaret hissed. Hale chuckled dryly. "Calloway was always just a pawn. I'm the one who made him king." "You think you control this city," Margaret growled, eyes locked on Hale. "I don't think," Hale sneered. "I know." Margaret's hands trembled. Not with fear, but with rage. "Not anymore." With a flick, she opened the notebook, pages fluttering like the wings of a bird about to take flight. Every page detailed offshore accounts, hidden assets, and the final destination, the Haven Trust. Hale paled. "Impossible. David Langley," Margaret sneered. "He gave me the key." Calloway lunged forward, voice raw with fury. "You don't have the guts." Margaret stepped forward, face inches from his, her voice a storm ready to break. "You made the same mistake 30 years ago. I'm here to finish what you started." Suddenly the doors burst open. Bang! Dozens of federal agents stormed in, weapons drawn, badges gleaming like the judgment of the gods. "FBI, nobody moves," the lead agent barked, his voice shattering the thick silence. Senator Hale stumbled back, color draining from his face. "No, this can't be." Calloway backed into the glass wall, sweat pouring down his face. "I am the law," he screamed desperately. "This is my city." Margaret shook her head, her voice a low, satisfied growl. "Not anymore." The agents moved swiftly, cold metal cuffs snapped shut around Calloway's wrists. Clack! The sound rang out like the final nail in a coffin. He thrashed, screaming, "You can't do this! I made this city! I own it!" Margaret's eyes burned with cold fire. "You owned nothing but your lies." Senator Hale tried to flee, but agents pinned him down. The fear in his eyes, pure, primal, was more satisfying than any victory Margaret had ever tasted. Daniel stood frozen, tears welling as he watched the mighty fall. Vincent let out a long, low whistle. "Damn, that's justice." Margaret turned slowly, locking eyes with Calloway one last time. "It's over, forever." Calloway spat, but the fight was gone from his eyes. "You think you've won. I know I have," Margaret whispered. The agents dragged the two men out, their angry shouts fading down the hallway. Silence fell, heavy and final. Margaret stood still, her breath slow, her chest rising and falling as if shedding the weight of 3 decades. She turned to Daniel and Vincent, her voice quiet but resolute. "This city, it belongs to the people now." Outside, the first light of dawn bled into the sky. Sunlight poured through the glass, washing away the shadows of the night. Margaret stepped forward, head held high, eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's over," she whispered. "And this time, it's over for good." The morning sun rose slowly over New York City, painting the sky in hues of gold and soft pink. The streets bustled with life, taxis honking, vendors shouting, people rushing by, unaware that somewhere in the heart of this city, a war had just ended. Margaret Hamilton stood quietly on the courthouse steps, the cold stone beneath her heels grounding her as cameras flashed and reporters swarmed the entrance like vultures. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. The headlines spoke for her. Former DA James Calloway arrested in massive corruption scandal. Senator Richard Hale faces federal charges in money laundering ring. Daniel stood by her side, his face pale but eyes filled with awe. I still can't believe we did it," he whispered, his voice trembling as if afraid the moment might disappear if he spoke too loud. Margaret let out a slow breath, her gaze never leaving the skyline. We didn't just do it, Daniel. We survived it. The weight of the past few weeks sat heavily on their shoulders. Betrayals, secrets, buried crimes clawing their way to the surface. And yet, for the first time in years, Margaret felt light. The chains she had carried, the ones no one could see, had finally broken. You think it's really over? Daniel asked, searching her face for certainty. Margaret gave a small, knowing smile. Nothing like this is ever truly over, but it's enough, for now. The crisp wind swept through the streets, tugging at her coat, carrying with it the smell of the city, damp concrete, roasted chestnuts, the metallic tang of subway tracks. It was chaotic, loud, messy, and it was home. Vincent appeared from the crowd, cigarette dangling from his lips. Cops took Calloway and Hale downtown, he muttered. Hale looked ready to piss himself. Never thought I'd see the day. Margaret smirked. That makes two of us. Vincent exhaled a slow stream of smoke. Word's already spreading. The city knows what happened. People are talking, Margaret, about you. She stiffened. Let them. Vincent gave a low chuckle. You're a legend now, you know that? The woman who brought down the untouchables. His grin faded slightly. What now? You disappear again? Margaret was silent for a long moment, watching the sunlight dance off the glass buildings. No, she finally whispered. Not this time. Daniel turned to her, eyes wide. What do you mean? Margaret's gaze hardened. I left once. Thought the fight wasn't worth it anymore. I was wrong. Her voice was steady now, carrying the weight of a promise. There will always be another Calloway. Another Hale. I can't walk away again. Daniel swallowed hard. You're really coming back? Margaret looked at him then. Truly looked, and for the first time he saw not just the battle-hardened lawyer, but the woman beneath. Tired, scarred, but still standing. I am, she said softly. There are too many voices still buried. Too many stories left untold. It's time someone spoke for them. Daniel blinked rapidly, trying to hide the tears brimming in his eyes. Then, I'm staying too. Margaret smiled, reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. Good. I'll need you. Around them the city moved on. Cars roared by, people bustled past. But something had shifted. The air felt different, lighter, like a storm had passed, leaving the sky clearer than before. Vincent flicked his cigarette away, his eyes narrowing. What about the others? The ones we didn't see? The ones still hiding in the dark? Margaret's jaw tightened. We'll find them, one by one, and when we do, they'll answer for every life they destroyed. A long silence settled between them, filled only by the distant hum of the city. Finally, Vincent nodded. Then, I guess this is just the beginning. Margaret laughed, a sound raw and genuine, catching even herself off guard. God help them if it is, Daniel chuckled, the sound breaking through the tension. You think they'll come after us? They might, Margaret admitted, but let them try. The three of them stood there, staring out at the vast city stretched before them, a maze of glass and steel, secrets buried deep beneath its foundations. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt ready. She turned to Daniel, her voice low but firm. There's a case file I want you to pull. Thomas Green. He's still in prison. It's time we finished what we started. Daniel blinked. You? You want to clear his name? Margaret nodded. I made him a promise. It's time I kept it. Vincent let out a low whistle. Damn. You really don't know how to quit, do you? No, Margaret said simply, and I never will. The wind picked up again, sending leaves skittering across the marble steps. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed, a slow, steady sound that echoed through the city like a quiet promise of change. Margaret took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she finally let go of the last piece of fear she'd been carrying. Come on, she said, turning toward the street. We've got work to do. Daniel followed, his heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. Behind them, Vincent grinned and shook his head. Damn right we do. As they walked away from the courthouse, from the ghosts of the past, the city stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving. But Margaret didn't flinch. She was back. And this time, she wasn't leaving. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. How many years has it been since the last time I stepped back into this fight? Margaret lifted her head, her eyes gazing at the towering skyline of New York City. The sunset cast a golden hue over the streets, but inside her all that remained was a cold, unforgiving gray. I thought I'd let it all go. Thought I'd learned how to live quietly, letting the world pass me by. But those bastards, they won't leave me alone. Her hand clenched tightly inside her thick coat, knuckles turning white from the rage burning in her chest. James Calloway, you came back like some monster in human skin. You really think you can trample justice, buy everyone, and force people to bow their heads again? The wind howled down the long street, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city, car horns, laughter, and the haunting echoes of a past that never truly died. No, not this time. No more running, no more bowed heads, no more choking silences. If I don't stand, who will? Who's going to fight for all those years stolen by their rotten system? Margaret's eyes flickered toward the young face of Danielle, still standing there, trembling but his gaze burning with determination. That boy? He needs to see a woman like me stand against all this corruption. Not for myself, but so he knows justice is real, as long as someone is brave enough to fight for it. She took a deep breath, her voice nothing but a whisper carried by the wind. But it struck like a blade. They think I'm weak. They think an old woman like me will run. A cold smirk pulled at the corner of her lips, sharp, dangerous. Then let's see, who's really running this time? Margaret inhaled deeply, her chest rising slowly as her eyes turned cold, steady and unshaken, a quiet storm brewing within. And finally, with a voice like steel, calm but deadly, she whispered the words that sealed her resolve. Let's finish what we started. Life teaches us that sometimes the darkest moments reveal the true strength within us. Margaret Hamilton's story is a powerful reminder. No matter our age, no matter how long we've been silent, it's never too late to stand up for what's right. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about knowing the risks, feeling the fear, and speaking up anyway. We all reach a point in life where we wonder if our voice still matters. But the truth is, wisdom and experience are what give our words the most power. Justice may not always come easily, but it comes when good people refuse to stay silent. No one is ever too old, too weak, or too late to fight for what's right. Not for themselves, not for their loved ones, not for the future. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Because real change starts with people like us, choosing to speak up, choosing to care.